rise of socialism in the 19th century was a profound and complex development that shaped the political and economic landscape of Europe and beyond. Rooted in the social and economic changes brought about by the Industrial Revolution, socialism emerged as a critique of the inequalities and exploitative practices of capitalism. Throughout the century, different strands of socialist thought emerged, each addressing the issues of class struggle, wealth distribution, and the role of the state in society. This period also saw the development of various socialist movements and political ideologies that sought to transform society and challenge the existing social order. Industrial Revolution and the rise of social inequality. The early 19th century was marked by the rapid expansion of industrialization, particularly in Britain, which spread to other parts of Europe and North America. The Industrial Revolution brought about significant technological advancements, including mechanized manufacturing, steam power, and improved transportation networks. These changes led to increased production and economic growth, but they also resulted in the concentration of wealth in the hands of a small capitalist class, while the majority of workers faced harsh working conditions and poverty. The rise of large factories and the division of labor created a stark contrast between the wealthy industrialists and the impoverished working class. Workers, often toiling in dangerous conditions for long hours and low wages, had little control over their lives or working conditions. This growing social inequality fueled dissatisfaction among the working classes, leading to calls for reform and change. Socialism, as a political and economic ideology, arose in response to these inequalities, and it sought to address the perceived injustices of the capitalist system by advocating for collective ownership of the means of production and a more equitable distribution of wealth. The idea of socialism was rooted in the belief that society should be organized to meet the needs of all its members, rather than being driven solely by profit and competition. Early socialism, utopianism, and reformism. The first theoretical foundations of socialism were laid out by early thinkers and reformers in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. These early socialists, often referred to as utopian socialists, sought to create ideal societies based on cooperation and equality. One of the most prominent figures of this period was the French philosopher Claude-Henri de Saint-Simon, who proposed a society where industrialists and workers would work together for the common good, guided by scientific management. Another important figure in early socialism was Charles Fourier, a French philosopher who envisioned a society based on communal living and cooperative labor. Fourier's idea of phalansteries, self-sustaining, cooperative communities, was one of the first attempts to create a practical model for a socialist society. However, his vision remained largely theoretical and had little impact on the broader political landscape of the time. The most influential utopian socialist was Robert Owen, a Welsh industrialist and social reformer. Owen believed that the conditions of the working class could be improved through education, better living conditions, and cooperative enterprises. He established a model community in New Lanark, Scotland, where workers were provided with decent housing, education for their children, and opportunities for leisure. Owen's work had a lasting impact on the development of the cooperative movement and social reform efforts in Britain and the United States. Despite their noble ideals, the utopian socialists were criticized for their lack of practical solutions to the problems of industrial society. Their visions of ideal communities were often seen as unrealistic and disconnected from the realities of class struggle and economic power. As the century progressed, socialist thought began to shift towards a more scientific and revolutionary approach, as new intellectual movements emerged. Marxism and the revolutionary approach. The most significant development in 19th century socialism was the rise of Marxism, based on the ideas of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Marxism rejected the utopian ideals of earlier socialists and instead proposed a scientific analysis of society based on historical materialism. According to Marx, the history of human society was shaped by the struggle between social classes, particularly the conflict between the bourgeoisie, capitalist class, and the proletariat, working class. Marx argued that the capitalist system was inherently exploitative, as capitalists profited from the labor of workers, without providing them with a fair share of the wealth they produced. This exploitation, Marx believed, would eventually lead to the collapse of capitalism and the rise of socialism. Marx's vision of socialism was one of collective ownership of the means of production, where the state would represent the interests of the working class and ensure the equitable distribution of resources. In the Communist Manifesto, 1848, written by Marx and Engels, the authors called on workers of the world to unite and overthrow the capitalist system. The manifesto became one of the most influential documents in socialist history, providing a call to arms for revolutionary change. Marx and Engels believed that the working class, through a process of class struggle, would eventually seize power and establish a socialist society in which the state would wither away and class distinctions would disappear. Marx's ideas were radical and revolutionary, advocating for the violent overthrow of the capitalist system. He believed that socialism could only be achieved through class conflict, as the working class would need to destroy the existing state apparatus and replace it with a new form of governance. This vision of socialism contrasted with the more gradual and reformist approaches of earlier socialists, who believed in peaceful change through education and legislative reforms. The spread of socialist movements. The ideas of Marxism and other socialist thinkers began to influence political movements across Europe in the mid-19th century. In many countries, socialist parties and labor unions were formed to advocate for the rights of workers and push for social and economic reforms. These movements were often met with resistance from governments and the ruling classes, who feared the rise of revolutionary socialism. One of the first major socialist uprisings occurred in France during the 1848 revolution, when workers and revolutionary factions attempted to overthrow the monarchy and establish a socialist republic. Although the revolution ultimately failed, it helped to spread socialist ideas and inspired similar movements across Europe. In the German states, the Social Democratic Party, SPD, emerged as one of the largest and most influential socialist parties in Europe. Led by figures like August Bebel and Eduard Bernstein, the SPD initially adhered to Marxist principles but later adopted a more reformist approach. Bernstein, in particular, argued that socialism could be achieved through gradual political change and social reforms, rather than revolution. Meanwhile, in Russia, Marxist ideas gained traction in the late 19th century, laying the groundwork for the Russian Revolution of 1917. The Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, RSDLP, led by figures like Vladimir Lenin, adopted Marxism as its guiding ideology and aimed to create a socialist state in Russia. Lenin's interpretation of Marxism, known as Leninism, emphasized the role of a vanguard party to lead the working class in the revolution, which differed from Marx's emphasis on spontaneous class struggle. The legacy of 19th century socialism. By the end of the 19th century, socialism had become a major political force in many countries. While the early hopes for revolutionary change had not yet been realized, socialist movements had succeeded in raising awareness of the injustices of capitalism and in advocating for workers' rights, social welfare programs, and democratic reforms. Socialism would continue to evolve in the 20th century, giving rise to various forms of socialist thought, including anarchism, syndicalism, and democratic socialism. The most notable outcome of 19th century socialism, however, was the eventual establishment of socialist governments in the 20th century, most famously in Russia after the October Revolution of 1917, which led to the creation of the Soviet Union. In conclusion, the rise of socialism in the 19th century was a response to the profound social and economic changes brought about by industrialization. It was marked by the development of new political ideologies, the growth of socialist movements, and the emergence of Marxism as a dominant force in shaping the future of socialist thought. While socialism in the 19th century was diverse and complex, it shared a common goal: the desire to create a more just and equitable society.